Thanks everyone for joining us on the program. I'm Joke Rogers in Lagos. Ukraine has claimed responsibility for a missile attack on the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Crimea. The Ukrainian military says it successfully hit the naval base in Sevastopol, but has given no further details of the attack. According to Russia's defense ministry, one military serviceman is missing after the attack, even as air defenses downed 5 missiles aimed at Sevastopol. It appears Ukraine is continuing to target the occupied Crimean Peninsula with missile and drone strikes. Last week, a Russian military base was hit and a submarine and warship destroyed. Meanwhile, Ukraine says Russia has started a new phase of what it calls energy terror ahead of winter. But Kyiv says the country is better prepared than last year when Russia targeted energy infrastructure with missile strikes. Away from Kyiv, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Canada for the first time since the Russian invasion. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with Mr. Zelensky and the First Lady on the runway in Ottawa. They were greeted on the tarmac by hugs from Canadian officials, including Mr. Trudeau. His visit comes after increasing doubts from international partners over how it should continue providing aid to Kyiv. Mr. Zelensky arrived from Washington, where he has hoped to secure further funding. He is expected to address the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa and also touch down in Toronto to meet with Canadian business leaders to strengthen private sector investment in Ukraine. In June, Mr. Trudeau made an unannounced trip to Kyiv, where he paid his respects at a memorial to Ukrainian soldiers killed fighting pro-Russian forces since 2014 and also addressed Ukraine's parliament. We'll have more on that story later on with the VOA correspondent Patsy Witzer-Kasawara. Before landing in Canada, President Zelensky met with U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House, where Mr. Biden assured him of U.S. support during this conflict. The U.S. president declared that Russia alone stands in the way of peace. So far, the U.S. has sent approximately $113 billion in security and humanitarian aid to help Mr. Zelensky's government since Russia invaded in February 2022.
Mr. President, the American people, Democrats, Republicans alike, families all across our nation understand what Ukraine is fighting to defend, what generations of Americans have also stepped up to protect and preserve. It's pretty basic: freedom, liberty, and sovereignty. And as I made clear at the UN this week, and you were there, the entire world has a stake in making sure that no nation, no aggressor is allowed to take a neighbor's territory by force. The American people will never waver in our commitment to those values. That's why, together with our allies and partners, we will continue to provide security assistance to support Ukraine's progress in reclaiming its territory. And we'll continue to provide humanitarian aid to help millions of innocents suffering from Russia's aggression. Russia alone stands in the way of peace. It could end this today. Instead, Russia is seeking more weapons from Iran and North Korea that would violate multiple UN Security Council resolutions that Moscow itself voted to put in place.
In a blitz across Washington, D.C., Mr. Zelensky also met with U.S. lawmakers and military leaders on Thursday. However, he and his wife, Olena, ended the evening with speeches at the U.S. National Archives Museum, thanking and reassuring the U.S. that its investment in Ukraine's security is working.
In our victorious battles for Ukraine and Kharkiv and the Snake Island in the Black Sea, in our battle for Bakhmut, where our soldiers are pressing forward no matter the challenges, in our battle for every inch of Ukrainian land, every day of this war, Ukrainian soldiers hold on with the grip of a bulldog. They chew and choke the Russian occupiers as much as possible. Never before had the Russian dictatorship met such strong resistance. And never again will Russia manage to destroy any other nation. Putin's list was long. Just recently, after Ukraine, if we fall, half of Europe would again be in danger of being in Moscow's sphere of influence. But American investment in Ukrainian security and global protection of freedom is working 100%, every cent.
As part of its support for Ukraine, the White House announced a new security package, even as further aid from the U.S. Congress is up in the air. This announcement concluded President Zelensky's visit to Washington. The aid will include arms and equipment from defense stocks and other weaponry. According to U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, this is to help Kyiv ahead of a tough winter.
This meeting comes at a significant moment as Ukrainian forces continue to make progress in their counteroffensive, and just after Russia launched yet another brutal wave of airstrikes against five cities in Ukraine that hit critical civilian infrastructure and knocked out power for many people in many different parts of the country. To help defend against assaults like this one, assaults from the air, President Biden will announce a new package of military assistance today that includes significant air defense capabilities to help Ukraine protect its people. These capabilities will help Ukraine harden its defenses ahead of what is likely to be a tough winter, filled with renewed Russian attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure to try to deprive innocent people of necessities like heat and electricity. Because President Putin cannot achieve his objectives on the battlefield, he is reduced to and is resorting to attacks that are intended to plunge ordinary people's lives into cold and darkness. And we are going to do everything working with the Ukrainians to make that task more and more difficult for Russia to be able to pull off. Above all, though, President Biden wants to use today to reaffirm his commitment, this administration's commitment, this country's commitment to continuing to lead the world in support of Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that's what he intends to do today. And with that, I look forward to taking your question.
Well, it appears not everyone in the United States is happy about the supply of more weapons and aid to Ukraine, despite Mr. Zelensky's speech in Washington. The question of whether the U.S. Congress will approve more aid to Ukraine's remains murky as Republicans on the far right express frustration with government spending. Ohio Republican Senator J.D. Vance feels there should be no more requests. He made this known in a post online and included a letter protesting against increased aid. This letter was signed by 28 Republicans. One of the signatories, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, later wrote on social media that he opposes any effort to hold the federal government hostage for Ukraine funding. And Polish President Andrzej Duda is unhappy about how his prime minister's statement about arms supply to Ukraine is being perceived. He says it's being interpreted in the worst possible way. Speaking to Polish private broadcaster TVN, Mr. Duda referred to Mateusz Morawiecki's words that Poland is no longer arming Ukraine and is focusing on rebuilding its own weapon stocks. The words were widely commented and appeared amid soaring bilateral relations due to a grain dispute just weeks before a Polish parliamentary election. However, Mr. Duda declared that his prime minister meant that Poland will not give out its new arms supplies purchased for its own army. Poland has been seen until recently as one of Ukraine's staunchest allies in its war with Russia. Mr. Duda and Mr. Zelensky did not hold a scheduled meeting on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, and this, the Polish president said, embittered him. In the meantime, Russia says it's alert to any threats from Poland, describing it as an aggressive country and a problem for Russia's ally, Belarus. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov made this known as also predicting a widening rift between Poland and Ukraine after Warsaw said it would not send new arms deliveries to Ukraine. However, President Andrzej Duda has said the statement was reported in the worst possible way. Well, Greece is also reiterating its commitment and support to Ukraine in the war against Russia. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis addressed the UN General Assembly, saying his country will never walk away from Ukraine. Mr. Mitsotakis also talked about the devastation of Storm Daniel, the worst hit in over a century. He spoke in the context of climate change, which he remarked is no longer a crisis of the poorest.
The assertion on Russia's part is that NATO, the EU, the other partners that support Ukraine will eventually lose the stomach to continue that fight. Now let me be clear. This should not happen, and this will not happen. We will never walk away from Ukraine, because to do so would be to abandon the very principles of peace, democracy, and adherence to international law that so many in this room hold dear, and sustainability for all. It is a laudable goal. Greece was struck by Storm Daniel. The Thessaly region, in the center of the country, saw twice as much rainfall in one day than falls in London in an entire year. It was the worst storm to hit Greece in over a century. And Daniel carved its destructive path not only through my country, but through Libya too. I accept, of course, that the climate crisis is not an alibi for everything, but the science is clear. Unprecedented temperatures, fueled by global warming, are creating the conditions that drive these catastrophic events. And this is no longer a crisis of the poorest or the global south. Our own very unequal battle with nature is now being fought out across the European south, and the Mediterranean in particular was razed to ashes.
In the meantime, Ukraine has confirmed the departure of a second cargo vessel carrying grain from Chornomorsk seaport. The ship named Arayat is on its way to Egypt, carrying 17,600 tons of Ukrainian wheat. Ukraine is seeking alternative shipping routes for its farm products after Russia backed out of a Black Sea grain export deal that allowed Ukraine to safely ship its grain during the war. The Arayat is the second bulk carrier that has entered the port of Chornomorsk using the temporary corridor for civil shipping. The first was Resilient Africa, with 3,000 tons of wheat shipped to Asia. Separately, diplomatic tensions elsewhere are on the rise after President Zelensky criticized Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary for banning imports of Ukrainian grain. NATO Secretary General is revealing that the alliance had tried to engage Russia in a diplomatic dialogue back in 2022 before Russia invaded Ukraine. Mr. Jens Stoltenberg said the invasion was part of a pattern that included Russia military action in Donbass and Crimea in Ukraine in 2014. He said this during an interview with the Council on Foreign Relations in New York on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly.
In December 2021, also a couple of months before the invasion, President Putin put forward what he he called it security treaties. He wanted the United States and NATO to sign documents that was sent to Brussels and to Washington. There were several demands. They demanded that we should remove all NATO infrastructure from the eastern part of the alliance. They demanded some buffer zones, especially in the Baltic region, meaning that most of the Baltic countries could not be protected with NATO forces. And they demanded, as a kind of ultimatum for not invading Ukraine, that NATO should guarantee no further enlargement. That was about no further enlargement with Ukraine, but also Finland and Sweden. it was not possible. We invited Russia to a dialogue. We said it's not possible for us to accept those ultimatums, but we made a real diplomatic effort to see if it was possible to sit down and find a diplomatic solution to the crisis that was also scaling up in the fall of 2021. But the declared purpose of the invasion of Ukraine was to stop further NATO enlargement.
Let's tell you more about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and we're joined on the program by VOA's White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara. Thank you for joining us today on The World Today.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
Right, so a lot has been said about what's going on in Ukraine, or the war between Ukraine and Russia. What's the latest on the aid being pledged by the United States to Ukraine in this war?
Yes, well, as you know, yesterday, President Volodymyr Zelensky came to visit the White House, and he met with President Joe Biden, and he also met with U.S. congressional leaders. And so essentially what is happening right now is the U.S. administration is trying to add another additional $20 billion to the $119 billion that's already been committed for Ukraine, rather $113 billion. And so this is additional funding that the administration is asking from Congress. Now, there's a huge question on whether or not that will be approved, because as we know, there are growing voices in the Republican Party. This is the opposition party to President Joe Biden, that's saying that, look, we have too many things to take care of domestically. We have the migration crisis, we have the inflation, and we have other economic pressures at home. Why should we be spending so much money? Why should we continue to pour billions after billions of dollars in Ukraine? Now, of course, the White House is trying to kind of shore up support from both sides of the aisle and trying to convince the American public that continuing to support Ukraine is within the American interest. This is something that you heard President Joe Biden spoke to just a few days ago at the UN General Assembly in New York, where he again rallied people around the world, countries around the world, to support Ukraine. I would note, however, a very interesting angle here at the UN is that President Joe Biden, compared to last year, he spoke within the first minute to denounce Russia's war on Ukraine. But this year in New York, he waited 22 minutes before discussing Ukraine and Russia's invasion, hitting first a series of global South concerns, understanding that there's also a Ukraine war fatigue, not just within the American people, but around the world as well.
And it seems that it's not everyone that's happy with the fact that U.S. is pledging more aid to Ukraine, especially when it comes to talking about the U.S. lawmakers. Is there still support on both ends to the U.S. pledging more, giving more aid, humanitarian aid, and of course weapons to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, this is precisely why President Zelensky came to Congress yesterday and met with congressional leaders from both sides of the aisle, Republicans as well as Democrats. Here, there's also a big difference. I mean, if you see the last time President Zelensky came to Washington, D.C., he gave a speech in front of Congress, and he was welcomed with standing ovation. And now there's a lot more questions. There's questions in terms of, is the money that's being sent used effectively? How is the Ukrainian military making do in terms of their counteroffensive towards Russia? These are questions that more and more lawmakers are raising, including particularly from the Republican Party. Having said that, both congressional leaders from both parties are saying that eventually there will be a united response to Ukraine, and we will continue. The American lawmakers say that they will continue to support Ukraine. Now, in terms of how much and for how long, that's still a debate. There's a lot of back and forth going on still right now, but definitely yesterday the Department of Defense did announce an additional security assistance package to meet Ukraine's critical defense needs. It includes additional capabilities to strengthen its defense, air defense systems, and the package that was drawn yesterday amounts up to $325 million so far, for just the package yesterday.
Patsy, many thanks again.
My pleasure.